When two highest rated chess players ever agree on the main idea to win at chess, it's hard to debate that. Here's what Magnus Carlsen said about his primary rule to win at chess.
And according to Garry, if you make 10 threats in a row, your opponent is going to blunder eventually.
Let's see how Magnus himself used this rule. Magnus is playing black against Trimidzius Petrus, and it is black to play. By the way, just to be clear, of course, not always you can actually execute 10 threats in a row, but the point is just to keep in mind the overall idea, right? Is you put pressure on your opponent by creating threats as much as you can, and sooner or later your opponent will crack under pressure and will blunder, which also means that you shouldn't shy away from very simple one-move threats that your opponent can easily parry, because you just keep mounting that pressure, and that's the overall idea. So this position was black to play. How can black attack right now? Well, there is no way. So Carlsen plays rook d7, preparing to stack rooks along the d-file and to attack this pawn. It doesn't seem like a big threat, and white can easily defend against it, but again, that's not the problem. We just want to create threats. White played rook d1, defending this pawn in advance. Black played rook d8, still putting pressure to this pawn, even though it's already defended. White just plays pawn to h3, and here black thought again, okay, how do I create threats? He played queen a4, adding one more attack to this pawn, and now white actually needs to defend. White played king to f1, solidifying his queen, and it turns out that, although black is attacking this pawn, he cannot capture it, because in this case, these queens will be traded off, and then white will be a piece up, so black can't capture the pawn. Okay, so black asks himself once again, then how do I attack something else? How do I move forward and attack something? And he played pawn a5, the move which again doesn't seem like a big deal at all. But he wants to play a4 and potentially create this weak pawn on b3 so that maybe he can somehow attack it down the line. Again, very simple threat, very light one. Still, white played pawn to a3, not a4, he played pawn a3. White's idea was that if black were to play a4, which he didn't, white would be able to shut it down with b4, keeping the position completely locked. But Carlsen in the game played another move. He saw this new weakness on a3, and he just played, okay, let me attack that pawn, played bishop to e7. Again, a one-mover, not a deep strategy at all, just a one-move, very simple threat. White noticed and played rook to a1. Here Carlsen once again asked himself, okay, how do I move forward and attack something? He played f5. The idea is to push this pawn to f4, and the bishop on e3 will be captured because it has nowhere to go. Again, very simple one-move threat. And, as the rule suggests, finally white blunders. Objectively, the position remains to be equal. But here white plays queen d3, wanting to eliminate the pressure and give some space for the bishop. But the blunder is that after this exchange, instead of f4, which indeed is no longer works, black's gotta move pawn e5, which wins the game. It attacks this pawn on d4, but on top of that it threatens pawn to e4 with a double attack to the rook and the knight, and white cannot defend against both threats. So as the rule suggested, as black kept creating very simple one-move threats, eventually white blundered. In the game he played rook d1 to prevent this e4 threat, but e4 was played anyway, kicking this knight away. After the knight goes back, now knight takes d4. Black is up a pawn in an endgame, and so when Carlsen is up a pawn in endgame, that equals to us having an extra queen, so he won the game easily. And now let's see how the actual author of the quote, Garry Kasparov, is following this rule. He's playing black in this game against Sarkisov, and it is black to play. White is up a pawn, and computer says that white is better, so let's see how Kasparov handled this situation. It's a standard position after an opening, and by the way, this rule is mostly suitable at the end of the opening stage and throughout the rest of the game. Because in an opening, definitely I do not recommend that you try to attack your opponent from the very first moves when you're completely undeveloped. Initially, you do need to develop your pieces, but after that, it is the right time to start applying this rule. Therefore, Kasparov goes rook b8, again making a simple threat to the pawn. White defends it. Now, what do you do when you have no threats? Well, you prepare a threat on the next move. So Kasparov plays rook a7, preparing to stack rooks along the b-file and to increase the pressure. White plays queen a2, and black executes his idea, rook b7. Here comes the second threat to this pawn. White decided to just trade pawns because on the previous move he attacked this one, so he took queen takes c4. And Kasparov could take this pawn on b2, but he decided to instead play rook to b4. Now, what was the idea? Did he hope that his opponent would blunder a queen? Of course not. But it was nice to push this pawn back, and overall, as much as you can attack, it's always nice to do so, right? So Kasparov is following his own rule, which he probably learned from this video. So white played queen to d3, and Kasparov keeps attacking with knight to c5. One mover attacking the queen. Queen goes away, and now rook takes b2. So it was actually just an exchange of pawns. White picked up this pawn on c4, black picked up the other pawn on b2, so that was an equal exchange. But nevertheless, black keeps putting pressure. This time the rook from b2 puts some pressure, to white's pieces. So white decided to trade it off, but still, this bishop is hanging, and white played bishop b1. The computer says it's wrong, but the move seems to make sense. And black goes pawn h6. One another very simple threat to the bishop, forcing it to trade or to go back. Now, what's the point? At first, it might seem like bishop takes h6 could win a pawn, but Kasparov here calculated that if white were trying to do that, that would leave this knight undefended, and black would be able to capture it because white has no queen on e3 anymore, which would defend this knight. So therefore, white could not go for this variation. White played queen to c1, aiming to counterattack the rook, thinking that black probably has to drop the rook back, and the bishop would be able to go back maybe to d2 and solidify white's position. That's what white was hoping for, but as you can see, computer marks it as a blunder, and it is indeed a blunder, because instead of moving the rook back, black has something a lot more powerful. He can play rook takes b1 and then pawn takes g5. And by doing so, he's getting two minor pieces for the rook, which gives black a winning material advantage. Now, is this just a luck for black that such a simple move as pawn to h6 could win the game? Yes and no. It was lucky that right at this particular moment white blundered something, but it wasn't luck because it's actually almost 7th threat in a row which black executed, and therefore it only makes sense that sooner or later white would blunder something. And it happens. White played queen to c1, and now after rook to b1, queen takes and pawn takes g5. Now black has two minor pieces for the rook, and he's having a winning material advantage. But nevertheless, let's see how the game continued, because Kasparov kept playing in the very same style. So here he goes pawn g4, again trying to go to opponent's half of the board and attack something. From here, we want to split up the pawns. White played queen to b5, offering an exchange of queens. Now, a lot of players would just trade queens off. But Kasparov knows that you gotta keep creating threats, so he's asking himself how to move forward and create a threat. And so he instead plays queen a3, attacking this rook. White played rook to c2, now pawn takes h3, makes this king exposed, which is nice. And here Kasparov goes for knight to d7. So Kasparov is a little bit solidifying his position, because white also could, deliver some sort of checks. And from here, the knight is ready to go to e5, but that is still actually a threat, because moving the knight away opens up this bishop, and therefore bishop takes c3 becomes a real threat. The knight is attacked twice, white needs to defend. So he goes queen c4 to defend this knight. Knight e5, yet another threat, this time hitting the queen. So Kasparov is literally creating threats at every turn. Queen to e2, and now knight goes forward to d3, once again renewing a threat, the very same threat to this knight. Finally, white dropped it back, and you see that in order to defend his position, white has to drop all of his pieces back, making them completely passive. Knight f4, this time as a fork to the queen and this pawn, so finally black can reap some fruits from his attack. Queen to e3. And here's a little question for you. How do you play here? Just think about this for a second. Again, I'm sure a lot of players would just take here happily, knowing that they have a bunch of extra pawns, but Kasparov still asks himself, how do I attack? He goes queen a4. From here, it x-rays the rook as well as the knight, and it's still unpleasant. White has to somehow defend them. White goes rook d2, and here bishop e5. Kasparov couldn't see the way to attack immediately, so he decided to bring one more piece closer to the attack, as well as to defend the knight. And after knight to c3, white blundered once again, even though his position was probably defenseless. Black just traded here and played queen takes c4 with a threat of queen to g2 checkmate, maybe queen e1, knight e2, like everything is threatening, and white just resigned. Today we've been talking about the favorite rule of Carlsen and Kasparov, but there's also the third player, considered by many to be the strongest player of all time, Bobby Fischer. And if you want to know the golden rule of Bobby Fischer that prevents 50% of your chess mistakes, check out this video and you'll be unstoppable. Also, if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing, join the Igor Nation, the nation of domination, and you will very soon start crushing all of your chess rivals.